In this video, I'm going to explain how to create a lovely, moody, long exposure effect like this. Here's my starting image, and you can see it's looking rather dull and flat. So we'll first of all convert it to a beautiful, moody monochrome, and then we'll add some movement in the clouds here by using a motion blur filter to mimic the effects of a long exposure. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to open up our black and white before image here into Camera Raw. So I'm in Adobe Bridge here at the moment, and I can right click my image, whether it be a JPEG or a RAW file, and I can choose to open it in Camera Raw. Now, to convert to monochrome, I can just grab the targeted adjustment tool from the tools panel up here, and all I have to do is right click and choose grayscale mix. That removes the color and also allows me to very quickly start adjusting the brightness of these individual color ranges here by clicking and dragging up or down over parts of my image. So I'm going to darken down the grass a little bit like this to around about there, I think, and I can tweak the other tones if I like. And I'm happy with that. Now let's go back to my basic panel, so I can click on the first icon here to bring us into the basic panel, and we can start to enhance the tones using the basic panel sliders. So let's start by upping the exposure a touch. We'll also perhaps add a touch of contrast. Let's perhaps knock down the highlights to bring back a bit more detail in those clouds. Let's also just increase the shadows a touch. I can hold Alt here and drag the whites here to bring me to a point that shows the clip pixels. So I want to drag it to a point just before those white areas appear, and I can do the same with the blacks. And then I can also add a touch of clarity with the clarity slider. And if I toggle that off and on, you can see the difference a few adjustments in the basic panel can make. Now I also want to darken down the sky here, and I can do that using the graduated filter tool. So I'll grab that from the toolbar up here, and then I can just click the negative icon here next to exposure to dial in a little bit of underexposure, and then all I have to do is drag down over the sky. Now if I hold shift as I drag, then my lines stay perfectly horizontal, which is quite useful for skies. So I'm dragged to about there, and then I can tweak that exposure if I like. I could also perhaps add a second grad from the corner up here just to darken down this top left corner, and then again just tweak the exposure until I'm happy. And I find it sometimes works to add a grad for the main part of the sky and then a second grad for the top half. So I'm going to drag another grad just down from the very top of the frame here down to about there, and that allows me to darken down that top part of the sky. And I think my image could do with a little bit more punch here, so I'm going to go back to my zoom tool icon here to bring me back my panel views, and then I'll click on the tone curve icon here. I'll make sure I'm in the point tab, and I can plot an S-shaped curve like this by dragging one point up near the top part of the line and a second point down near the bottom, and that just increases the overall contrast. I can perhaps add a third point in the middle to control the midtones. I can just keep tweaking these points until I'm happy. If I toggle that off and on, you can see the difference that one makes. Now I'm going to make one final adjustment here to pull out some of the detail in the road and to enhance this strong shape that we've got kind of winding through our landscape here. So I'm going to use the adjustment brush for this. I'll grab that from the toolbar up here, and I just need to dial in some positive exposure, so I can click the plus icon next to exposure here to dial that in. I also want to make sure this option down here is on for the mask, or I can hit Y to toggle the mask overlay on or off. And I'm also going to check this option down at the bottom here to auto mask, and that means that the brush will seek out the edges as I paint. So I can quickly paint over the road here, and you can see how the brush kind of snaps onto the edges of the shape as I paint. So I don't need to be so precise when I'm painting using the auto mask setting. And I'll continue just painting over the road as it recedes into the distance here. Let's zoom in a little bit and then paint over this section here. And quickly whiz around the bends like this until we get down to the bottom. Now there are a few areas where I've gone over the edges slightly, so I can hold Alt and then paint to subtract those areas. So just by holding Alt and painting, I can just fine tune which areas are going to be affected by the adjustment that I'm making. So let's zoom back out, and again let's perhaps hold Alt and just subtract this little area here. So now I've got a decent mask. I can uncheck the mask overlay here or hit Y to toggle that off, and you can see now how my exposure setting here is working over that road to really make it much brighter. So we could push that as far as we like, really. I think we'll keep it somewhere around about 0.65 there, and that's looking pretty good. So I'm happy with that. So now I'm ready to blur the clouds, and to do this we need to open the image into Photoshop. So I'll click the Open Image button down here. And then once in Photoshop, I'll bring up my layers panel here by going to Window Layers. Let's position that over here for now. And I want to make a selection of the sky. And I can do this using the Quick Selection tool, which you'll find in the Tools panel over here. And all I have to do is paint over the sky. And you'll see how the tool does a pretty good job of snapping on to that area. Now, I've noticed in the corner down here it's gone slightly wrong, so I can hold Alt and Paint to subtract that area from my initial selection. And I can also, if I like, use the Select and Mask button up here to take my selection into the Select and Mask command, where I can use the settings to enhance the edge. So I could perhaps up the radius a little, and this just increases the area of refinement along the edge. I can also use this Refine Edge Brush tool if there are any really tricky elements in my selection edge, but with this quite simple selection of this nice hard-edged hill line here, our selection is going to be pretty good. So I'm happy with that. So I'm going to hit OK to apply, and that brings me back out to my view of the selection. Now what I'd like to do is copy this selected area to a new layer, and I can do that using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control and J. That's Command J on a Mac, Control J on a PC. If I bring up my layers panel here, you can see now how we've got a section of sky here that sits on its own layer above the original image. In fact, let's rename that sky. Now I'm going to apply a blur filter to my sky layer, but to keep the blur filter non-destructive, first of all I'm going to right click the layer here in the layers panel and convert it to a smart object. And I'm also going to hold Command or Control, that's Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and click the thumbnail here, and that allows me to load a selection based on the shape of that layer. So we've just selected that sky area again, and we need to do that to confine the blur effect just to the sky. Then we can go to Filter, Blur, and Radial Blur. Now we'll set the blur method to zoom here, and let's also go for the best quality. And then we can adjust the amount slider here to increase or decrease the strength of the blur. And we can also choose a center point for our blur. So you can see we can tweak this little grid here to choose a center point. So let's see how that's looking. We'll hit OK to apply that. And you can see how that's blurring the sky. Now it's slightly too strong and also perhaps slightly too centralized. So what I can do is double click the smart filter here in the layer to re-enter those radial blur settings. So we can tweak the blur until we're happy. So I could perhaps just knock it down a touch, maybe move the center point off to one side slightly, hit OK to apply, and we'll see how that looks. That's looking a bit more natural, I think, but I think perhaps I'd like it coming in towards the other edge. So I'm going to bring it across to about there, and again hit OK. And I'm happy with that. So there we have it. That's my finished image. That's how to convert your image to monochrome using Camera Raw before taking it into Photoshop and adding a lovely motion blur to the clouds.